Hey Internet, hey YouTube, this is Nate. You can also call me Nathan, but please never call me Nathaniel. And today's guide is on death. Specifically, how death works in Monster Train. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about what are the different methods that you can die, or what are the different ways that you can die. Where do you go when you die? Again, referring to Monster Train. If you're looking for real life death advice, go to your local spiritual leader or go research online. But if you're looking for how to die and where you go when you die in Monster Train, this is definitely the guide for you. And as well, I want to talk about some things that happen depending on the situation, because death is not a straightforward thing in Monster Train. It may seem like a straightforward mechanic, but actually there's a lot of layers to it. Certainly more layers than a lot of other games have with death. So let's start at the very beginning. So what are the different methods of death in Monster Train? Well, the most straightforward, right? The most straightforward is just combat death. So you have your units out, their unit hits you, and you die. Or similarly, they have spikes, your unit hits them, and you die, right? This is the, I guess, most common, right? You hit units, they hit you, and then you die to combat, okay? But it's not the only way you can die. There's actually a lot of other different ways you can die. One of them that can happen is you can use a spell. You can use a spell either to target your own unit with spell damage. So take something like rail spikes or a torch or something like that, right? You can also play a spell that specifically kills a type of unit. This would be imp units. So there are imp unit spells that specifically target imps and kill those imps in exchange for an effect. So there's combat death, there is spell-related death, there is also burnout-related death. So you can put burnout onto units. You put burnout onto units. Once the burnout reaches 1, at the end of that next turn, the unit's going to die to burnout. And there's already a difference between dying to combat and dying from a spell and dying from burnout. 3 very different effects. There's also a couple other interesting ways that you can also die. One of them is from enhancing your health to 0. There are 2 methods of enhancing your health to 0. One of them is using the spell Razor Sharp Edge. Razor Sharp Edge minuses your current and max health by 2. And if you put that below 0, it will kill the unit. You can also enhance your health to 0 if you have an Offering Totem. Offering Totem has an incant trigger, minus 5 health, and draw a card. And if you do that enough, you will enhance your health to 0. Oh, and one way I didn't mention before, a way you can die, is you can die due to the boss being ascended. So when the boss is ascended, he kills everything on the floor where he was. This is only during Relentless, so I'm not talking about flying bosses, but when the boss is in Relentless, if you ascend the boss to a higher floor, all of the units will instantly die that were on the same floor as the boss. So again, just to summarize, different methods of standard dying. You have combat, and that can be taking damage or getting damage due to spikes. You can die to spell interactions. So you target your own unit with a damage spell, or you target an imp with an imp kill spell, or you play something like, you play Crushing Demise, or you can stat enhance yourself to death. So you can either have an Offering Totem that's stat enhancing itself. You can play Razor Sharp Edge. You can die to burnout, or you can die to having the boss be ascended and you're on the floor where the boss was before the boss ascended, and the boss kills everything on the floor instantly. Those are the standard methods. There's one other method of dying that is unique to Morsels or to Primordium, which is you can also die to being gorged. So then we come to the question, okay, these are the different ways that you can die, but what happens when you die? the very first thing that happens when you die is you lose instantly all buff effects. So if you have any buffs at all that are applied to your unit, those buffs will be gone instantly, with one exception. So again, we're talking about buffs that are applied. You played a card or you had a relic apply a buff. That can be rage, spikes, regen, armor, damage shield, lifesteal, multi-strike, trample, quick. Any applied spells, notice I didn't say sweep because you can't apply sweep, but any applied spells, or applied buffs, any applied buffs will instantly be removed from your unit no matter the method of how they died. So no matter what, if your unit dies, they will lose all applied buffs, buffs that you played on them during the battle. What will be maintained? They will maintain any stat enhancements. So stat enhancements for any reason. That can be steel enhancers, root seeds, can be the reform stat buffs, can be extinguish trigger stat buffs. It doesn't matter. If you're increasing the base stats at all, and I say increasing, but actually it's any modification to stats will be maintained when the unit dies. And it doesn't matter how they die, and it doesn't matter where they go when they die. They maintain all of their stats. They will also maintain text buffs. So if there is a text buff, this will be maintained. And what is a text buff? This means a text that is on your card by default. So any reactions or triggers, so your revenge triggers, your incant triggers, your whatever, anything that's written on the text of the card, including additional text that comes from stones, will be maintained. So if you apply multi-strike via a stone, that gets maintained through death. But if you apply multi-strike via furnace tap, you will lose the multi-strike when you die. And I think that's a very important distinction. Anything that you apply, again, all of those buffs, if they're applied during the battle, you will lose them on death. Okay, so that's what happens to your unit. And again, that doesn't matter. Same with Morsels. If Morsels get extra stats and they die, even if they're dying to getting eaten, if you bring the Morsels back, they're going to include all those stats. Okay, so that's what happens. You maintain stats, you maintain text. I did say there was one exception, and there is one exception. The one exception is endless if your endless comes from the Remnant Pact. And again, distinction. It does not come from artifacts. If you get endless from an endless artifact, it does not get maintained on death. You will lose it when you die. But when you get endless due to Remnant Pact, for some reason, Remnant Pact is the exception to all other buff applied rules. And then there's kind of a half exception. The half exception is if your unit is reformed, the reform itself applies one extra burnout to the text of the card, and that also gets maintained. And again, distinction, if I apply burnout to a unit and then it dies, that burnout is not maintained. But if I reform a unit, thereby adding reform to the text of the card, it gets maintained. I know it's kind of confusing, but that's the best way that I can say it, is if it's something that is writing text on the card itself, and it's going to be basically permanent, it will be maintained through death. And those two cases are endless and are burnout from reforming. That gets maintained. All other types of buffs are going to be removed from the card when the unit dies, no matter how the unit dies. Okay, so we talked about how you can die. We talked about what happens when you die. Next is, where do you go when you die? And the answer is that depends. It depends on a couple of things. Most of the time, if your unit's dying to normal types of deaths, so that's getting hit by units, spikes, spells, burnout, boss killing the floor, any of the standard stuff, your unit's going to go directly into the discard pile, where your consume pile. It's the same place that you go when your card gets consumed. So that same pile where you have all your consume cards is also where your units go, at least visually in the UI. That's where they go. And that's where reform cards look when it looks to pull units back. It looks at your consumed pile. And so we talked about timing a little bit. If a unit dies during your turn, it immediately goes into the consume pile and is immediately available to be reformed. If you have something like burnout, as another example, when you burn out at the end of turn, that's when you will enter the consume pile. That's standard death. But there are other ways or other things to consider when dying. Morsels. When morsels die due to being gorged, or to being eaten, I should say, when morsels die to being eaten, same with primordium, they go into a gorge consume pile, a separate pile from the standard consume pile. And the implications of that mean that you cannot reform morsels or reform primordium if they die to being eaten. There is a separate one card that interacts with the eaten consume pool, and that is Wretch. So the only way to get units back that go into this consume eaten unit pile is by using the card Wretch. The only way to bring back units in the consume pile is either by reforming Formless Child. So Formless Child and Reform will pull from your consumed pile. Wretch pulls from your eaten consumed pile. And then there's two other places units can go. The third is if units have the endless tag. So if units have endless, either because you've applied it to them through a stone, or because you got it through a relic, or because you got it through the Remnant Pact, or because you have it as a mutator, any of those different ways that you're going to get endless tags on your units, if your unit dies, they immediately go to the top of your not yet drawn deck. So the deck that you're drawing from, if your unit has endless, it goes to the top immediately when it dies. Immediately. So the moment it dies, that means if you kill it during your turn, that will immediately go to the top and be the next card you would draw. And then if you kill another endless unit, it will go on top. And so it's kind of in reverse order. You'll see this if you kill a whole bunch of endless units, you'll recognize that they will show up in your draw pile in the same order that they died in reverse. So the most recent one being on top and then going further and further back as you go down. Yeah, your draw pile, exactly. So they will go to the top of your draw pile immediately. This means that if you have a unit die, so for example, let's say you have endless on an imp and you play important work. Important work kills the imp immediately, and by the way, the order matters. It kills the unit first. It kills the unit has endless, it immediately gets on top of your draw pile, which then important work second effect, draws the imp back again. That's why you can use important work to cycle imps, because those endless units will immediately show up on the top of your draw pile. And again, it doesn't matter how they die, doesn't at that point. I should also mention that things that get eaten that have endless, it's the same effect. If you put endless onto a morsel or put endless onto primordium, when they die, they will, if they die to being gorged, to being eaten, they will immediately show up at the top of the deck. There's a question. Does Channel Song influence Endless? Well, the other way around. Endless influences Channel Song, because Channel Song will always pick the next unit in the draw pile. It's the closest unit to the top of the draw pile is the one that will get pulled, which means if you just kill an Endless unit and then play Channel Song, it will always draw that Endless unit because it's at the top of your draw hand, of your draw pile. So yes, all these interactions come together, and that's kind of what I want to go into a little bit more details now. So we've talked about before I go on, there is a fourth place units can go, which is away. They go away, and this is specifically units that have purge. You can get purged through a mutator. You can get purged through the Purge Stone event from the Concealed Caverns. If these units die, they can, during the battle, depending on how you have purged. So if it's a Purge Stone and the unit dies, you can actually reform them. They will show up in the consume pile. You can reform them. But after the battle, they're gone. The mutator acts differently, in fact. With the mutator, with the permadeath mutator enabled, if your unit dies, it is gone. It is away. It does not exist any longer. There's no reforming it. It's completely purged from your deck. Which is, I also find kind of interesting that the Purge Stone itself, you still have a chance to reform the unit during the battle, but when you actually have permadeath, it's like just yeeted. It's gone. It's never coming back. Okay, so those are the 4 places. Again, to summarize, you have the consume pile for standard deaths. You have the eaten consume pile, specifically for Morsels and Primordium when they are eaten. And you have the top of the draw pile for endless units. And then you have the nether for units with permadeath. Okay, so that's where you go. So now we've talked about how you die. We talked about what happens when you die. And we talked about where you go when you die. Not philosophically. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you end up, when you really die, you end up in the consume pile for, I don't know, some demon in Saturn. And he'll get to replay you as a flower or something. I don't know. But at least as far as I'm aware, this is exclusive to Monster Train. So then the next question is, how does this interact with different aspects of the game? And I think that's the part that's more relevant. These are all like the mechanics behind death, but let's talk about interactions. We're going to talk about it using the logbook because there's so many, it's hard to demonstrate in game. So unlike the last guide, I'm not going to do a full game and walk through and talk about it all the way through. I will post a link to some of the games from the stream so that you can get some ideas, and I will talk through the implications of death. But just for this guide purpose, I'm just going to focus on going to the logbook because then I think I can get the broadest level of application. Okay, so let's jump in. First thing I want to talk about is, again, reform. So reform gets applied to units that are in the consume pile. And again, as we talked about, timing becomes very important. If I want to reform a unit immediately, and it's not in the consume pile yet, I can target it, kill it, in order to immediately bring it back, right? So I can kill a unit. I can, for example, torch an imp, and that imp will immediately be in my consume pile so that I can reform it right away. And so when you have builds like Dark Harvest builds, or when you have builds that rely on a unit growing due to reform, even Firelight builds are another good example where you want things to die immediately and then be reformed over and over again. The self-kill and reform in the same turn is a very, very effective strategy because, again, it immediately puts the unit in the consume pile so that you can immediately reform them. And you can do that multiple times. There's a build that I used to do when we do speedrunning, which is a Burn Bright Rector Flicker build that relies on 2 cards. You take your Crushing Demise, and you have a Molded, and you literally just play them over and over again to continue to buff Rector Flicker with more health, more damage, more burnout, and as well clear the floors at the same time. Very, very solid build for speedrunning. It falls off a little bit coming to 25, but it's a pretty good build if you're playing in early Covenants. Another thing to consider, again, is the burnout effect of reform, right? So if your unit doesn't have any burnout, when they die, the first time you reform them, they're going to come with burnout and immediately die again. And that will stack every single time you reform. Another reason why you might want to do this kind of kill and reform multiple times. It's a way to get a lot of burnout very quickly onto a unit, including as well as all the stats. So that's I mean, there's a lot we could talk about with reform, but I think that hits like the major points, right? Reform works as a way to bring units that are in your consume pile that have died due to standard ways back. Reform will not target endless units. Reform will not target morsels. It will only target units that fall into your consume pile due to normal death interactions. Okay, next up, let's talk about Extinguish. So extinguish triggers are very, very interesting. A lot of different units have extinguish triggers. They're almost all Melting Remnant, but not exclusively. There is Spike Driver Colony that also has an extinguish trigger. But basically, they all operate the same. When this unit dies, except for Intent on Death, which is a spell, but all the rest are, when a unit dies, do this effect. And how they die does not matter. If they die due to burnout, if they die due to bosses doing their thing, if they die due to getting normally killed, whatever, then this effect will happen on death. And again, timing matters. So I can give you some examples. If you kill a Molten Encasement during your turn, the stealth gets applied immediately. If Molten Encasement dies to burnout or to regular death, it gets applied at the end of the turn, which might have some implications again. You might want, for example, to not have stealth on all the units. Maybe you have 2 Molten Encasements and you want to kill off one of them so that when you play the second one, it doesn't get the stealth from the first one. So there's a strategic element here of saying, okay, or maybe it's not a Molten Encasement. Maybe it's a Remnant Host. You have both a Molten Encasement and a Remnant Host. You would like both to trigger, but you know that if you put the stealth in front, it's going to stealth the Remnant Host. So you don't want to do that. So instead, you kill the Molten Encasement, and then you play the Remnant Host afterwards so that the Remnant Host doesn't get stealthed. So there are some interactions you can do that are kind of cool with Extinguish triggers, knowing that you can manipulate death during your turn. You don't just have to wait until units die. Devour of Death has some special interactions because Devour of Death feeds off of things that have died. And so if you can kill things during your turn or position him effectively so that things die in the right order, and that includes things like burnout because... if let's say you have like a bunch of units with burnout and Devour of Death is like the third in line, the first 2 units that burn out, he'll harvest their deaths, and then when he burns out, he'll do his AoE. But if you were to instead place him in the front, he would burn out first, not get their deaths, not harvest their deaths, and wouldn't do as much AoE. So positioning of units becomes very important when it comes to considering how death is going to affect things. One thing I will note, Intent on Death does not kill the unit, and it does not count as a death. It just triggers the extinguish ability without killing it. That's what it says in the text. But just to be clear, killing it with extinguish, killing it or using Intent on Death is not going to trigger any type of death interaction. It just triggers the extinguish trigger. Okay, that was a lot around extinguish. The next thing we'll talk about is morsels. Because as we said, morsels have a unique mechanic about how they die. And you can include Primordium in here because he basically is a morsel on steroids. So morsels now have the chance to die in 2 different ways. They can die due to regular combat, and they can die to being eaten. And they have different effects as we discussed. Morsels that die due to regular death from getting attacked or from spells or from the boss destroying the floor, they go directly into your consume pile and can actually be reformed and will get burnout, will get the extra stats, and they'll maintain that no matter how they die in the future. So there's a strategic element there where sometimes it might actually be better for your morsels to die due to like actually getting killed rather than eaten because you can reform them and scale them and maybe you use them as chump blockers or something like that. There's there's one more interaction I want to talk about, and this goes together with morsels a little bit, is harvest. So harvest is a mechanic where as something dies on the floor, an effect occurs. There are these 4 harvest units. You can get a 5th one with Rector Flicker, but basically they all operate the same way. When something dies on the floor, doesn't matter when they die, do this effect immediately. And so take this example with morsels. If a morsel gets eaten, it did not die, it got eaten, goes into a different pile, and it doesn't trigger harvest triggers, which is actually a change they made. It used to be that morsels did trigger harvest, but they changed that with the recent patch, the Friends and Foes patch, in order to, or not the Friends and Foes, with the what is the most recent patch? Herzl's Workshop patch, which changed this. So now the harvests don't trigger off of morsels, which is both a good and a bad. On the good side, it means that enemy harvests no longer trigger, but it also means that harvests on your own side also don't get triggered. And so there's sometimes an incentive if you have something like a harvest baron or a big sludge, rather than eating the morsel, you might just want to chump block and let it die, because then you get the harvest trigger, which might be more valuable, and in some cases will definitely be more valuable than the morsel's eaten effect. Plus then you have the chance to reform and get it back and have it die again. So again, there's a lot of implications around harvest, and there's similar, like harvest is a good incentive to kill units during your turn because you immediately get the effect. Order of units can affect harvest triggers. If you have units in the front that are dying versus in the back that are dying, will affect whether you get that effect before the unit takes their turn or after the unit takes their turn. We talked about this with Devour of Death already. If Devour of Death is in the back and a whole bunch of units die in front, then when it dies, it does its effect. But if it's in the front and all these units die, if they don't die before the Devourer of Death, he doesn't get their souls and doesn't get the effect. So unit order matters a lot when you're thinking about harvests, and death matters a lot when you're thinking about harvests as a way to generate value out of these harvest units. There's one final mechanic associated with unit deaths, and that is there are spells that interact with the number of deaths that have occurred. So there's Memories of the Melted. Memories of the Melted will give you 1 ember for every unit that has died. And again, this is death in the standard sense. It doesn't consider morsels being eaten in counting the friendly units that have died. So morsel eaten is excluded, but all other types of deaths, whether they're endless or not, or purged or whatever, all count towards Memories of the Melted's amber gain. The same holds true for a Fatal Melting and Memento Mori. So all these spells are going to gain value off of the number of deaths you have. And again, not to, I'm probably hammering this home too much, but you can consider that killing units during your turn will immediately buff these cards, allowing you to immediately generate value out of these cards. Okay, so one final interaction set I want to talk about is interactions with relics. So there are some relics that interact with unit deaths as well, and it's going to be very similar to some of the ones we talked about. One of them is Mold Braces. Mold Braces adds an extra Extinguish trigger to all units, and that Extinguish trigger is apply 5 armor on the next, or on the front friendly unit. So that means that if a unit dies in the back, it's going to apply it to the front, or if it's the unit in the front, it's going to apply it to the next unit behind. Standard Extinguish effects. Again, if it happens during your turn, it happens at the end of the turn, it can affect at what point that armor gets applied and also to what unit it gets applied to. But it's going to be operating similar to a standard Extinguish effect. Then you have Memorial Fund. Memorial Fund kind of acts like a harvest, and probably the best way to say it. It's a harvest that's affecting all the floors. And again, if you read the text, it's gain 5 coins when a friendly unit dies. So it's not any unit, it's just friendly units. And it only applies to units that die to standard deaths. So it doesn't include morsels being eaten. So, but if any other type of unit dies to other effects, burnouts, getting killed, spells, whatever, then you'll get your 5 coins. And it doesn't matter where they are, it affects all floors. Votive Key adds Endless. We talked about what Endless does. And I mentioned then, and just to remind, this Endless does not remain through death. So this Endless gets applied only until that unit dies, and then it's removed. This is different from Remnant Pact. Remnant Pact applies it for the rest of the battle. So you will have Endless, and it will be maintained no matter how many times the unit dies. This one is, Votive Key is only, the Endless is only applied until that unit dies, and then it goes away. Waxer Snuffer, it's, I would just mention it because it does double all Extinguish triggers, which is pretty sick. Just makes all of those Extinguish triggers much better. It actually combines with Mold Braces. So if you have Mold Braces, because Mold Braces adds an Extinguish trigger, it will double that Extinguish trigger. It does not double Memorial Fund. So to clarify. Next one is Resin Block. So Resin Block is very similar to Memorial Fund. It is not an Extinguish trigger, so it doesn't get applied to Wax or Snuffer. It works that when a unit dies, apply +10 to that unit. And again, because it's a stat enhancement, that's going to remain for the entire battle, no matter how many units die. And again, to be clear, that unit has to die to normal means. So similar to Harvest, it can't die to being eaten. If it dies to being eaten, it doesn't get the +10. But if it dies for any other method, it will get the +10 on Reform. Okay, so that covers all of the artifacts. And with that, that covers all the interactions. So I'm very lucky that I am on stream because chat keeps reminding me about things that I'm missing. Before we go to the summary, I'm also going to talk about 2 final artifacts. Exploding Candle. So Exploding Candle, it doesn't add an Extinguish trigger. It adds a very specific Harvest effect. And the reason that I say it that way is because it doesn't get doubled by Wax or Snuffer, but it only affects burnout units. And what happens is when a burnout unit dies, it does 5 damage AoE to the entire floor. It's a very special effect. It's probably closer to like Resin Block and Memorial Fund, except that it only affects burnout units. So it's not an Extinguish trigger. It is just a trigger that happens when friendly burnout units die. And similar, Encased Ember is a kind of specific Harvest. Encased Ember is gain Ember when a tomb unit dies. So when a unit with the tomb tag, this would be like Molten Encasement, what is it called? I was going to say Excavation Explosion. That's not right. It's Entombed Explosive. Sorry, Entombed Explosive is another tomb unit. And then the Formless Child. When these 3 units die, you get 5 Ember immediately. And again, so if you kill them yourself, you get the 5 Ember right away. If they die at the end of turn, the 5 Ember carries over into the next turn. And now I think we can go to the summary. That was all of the artifacts having to do with death. I think. I know it's kind of a lot of information, but I hope that it's been helpful, covering all the different interactions around death, how units can die, what happens when units die, this buffs versus stat enhancements, what gets maintained, what gets lost. And if you're like me, you've probably had that before where you put multi-strike on a unit, it died, you reformed it, and you were very sad because you lost your multi-strike. So keep in mind this interaction that all buffs get eliminated that are applied during the battle. We talked about where they go. Some units are going to go to your standard consume pile. Most units will. Your morsels, your primordiums, when they're eaten, will go to your eaten consume pile, and then your endless units are going to go to the top of your draw pile. And we talked about a lot of these interactions with Extinguish triggers, interactions with Harvest triggers, and interactions with spells, these spells that gain value the more units have died. And then, of course, talking about like Morsels, how they have this kind of dual death scenario where they can die standard, they can die by being eaten, and there are different implications. So again, hope this has been helpful for you. Hope that you're able to use some of this information in your future runs, get some more value out of the deaths of your units. Maybe consider doing some self-spell killing to gain value. And if you did enjoy this and this was helpful, please give the video a like, comment below. If you haven't yet and you've been liking a lot of these guides or these videos, please subscribe. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.